The call came at midnight, and Sarah Voss was already awake. She had not slept properly in 4 days, not since the house began to feel wrong, in a way she could not quite describe, like a piece of familiar furniture shifted just slightly from its usual place. Not enough to name immediately, but enough to keep making her glance at the same corner, wondering what had changed. The Voss house was not a large one, but it had always been a noisy one. Her father moved through it, with the kind of restless energy that kept every conversation slightly too fast, and every dinner slightly too loud. Her sisters filled the silence he left behind with their own talk, plans, opinions, complaints about the weather and the market, and which of the neighboring families had done something interesting or irritating that week. For 4 days, that noise had stopped. Or not stopped exactly, but thinned. Conversations ended when she entered rooms. Her father had not looked directly at her since Sunday. Her mother had pressed a dry kiss to her forehead that morning, and held it there a fraction too long, in the way of someone trying to leave something behind in a person they are about to lose. Sarah had noticed all of this. She was not the kind of person who missed things. She had been sitting on the edge of her bed with a book open in her lap, a collected history of the Northern Territories she had been meaning to finish for months, when her father's voice reached her through the wall. "Sarah, come down." She set the book on her desk, straightened her dress, and walked down the hall. The study was lit with 4 candles. Lord Aldrich Voss stood behind his broad desk, with both hands flat on its surface, chin slightly elevated, a posture she recognized as the one he used when he needed to feel in command of a situation that was already beyond him. Behind him on the wall was the map of the trade territories he had inherited from his father and had been slowly losing ground in for 20 years. 2 strangers stood near the bookcase, a man in a gray traveling coat with a dark emblem stitched at the collar, a crown encircled by a ring of thorns, and a woman with a leather case over her shoulder. They were looking at Sarah without expression, the way people look at objects they are taking inventory of. Her sister Mira stood by the window with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, staring at the wall. Lena was just behind her, as she always was when something uncomfortable was happening. Her mother sat in the corner chair, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes directed downward. Sarah sat down across from her father before he could invite her to. "I will be direct," he said, which was what he said whenever he intended to be anything but. He explained the debt first. She had known in a general sense that the Voss family finances were stretched. There had been the bad years when she was 12, and again at 16, and several difficult seasons in between. But she had not known the full shape of it. She had not known about the arrangement made with the Obsidian Court's lending arm when she was not yet 3 years old, when her father had borrowed a sum substantial enough to require a royal seal on the agreement. She had not known about the compound interest, or the missed payments quietly negotiated away, or the letter that had arrived 6 months ago from the Obsidian Court's treasury representatives explaining that the family now had 2 options: immediate full repayment, or an alternative arrangement. "What alternative?" she said. Her father shifted his weight. "The Obsidian Court has a tradition," he said carefully. "When a ruling lord or king is without a companion, when there is a ceremonial position that needs to be filled." "What alternative?" she said again, because she could already see the shape of the answer, and she wanted him to say it plainly. He said it plainly. One unmarried woman of the family, of appropriate age, offered to the Obsidian Court to serve as a companion tribute to the Alpha King. In exchange, the entire debt would be erased. No further obligation, ever, from the Voss family to the court. He had agreed to this 6 months ago. The room was very quiet. "6 months," Sarah said. He did not answer. "You have known for 6 months and told me nothing." "The process required confirmation of several arrangements," he said. "I wanted to be certain before." "Before what?" she said. "Before you told me you had signed my name to a document I never saw?" Mira made a small sound near the window. Not distress. Adjustment. The kind of sound a person makes when they are exhaling a fear they have been holding. Sarah looked at her father. "Why me?" He met her eyes for the first time that evening, and what she saw in them was worse than anger. It was the mild, settled expression of a man who had already done his accounting and found it satisfactory. "Your sisters are spoken for," he said. "Mira is engaged to Owen Halvard. Lena's match with Arthur Crestwood is being finalized. You had no arrangement. It was the most practical, she said quietly. "Yes." She stood up. She walked to the door of the study. "The soldiers will be here within the hour," her father said behind her. "You should prepare." "I am aware," she said, and walked out. She went upstairs. She went to her room. She stood in the middle of the floor and looked at the familiar objects around her, the desk with the old ink stain, the bookshelves with their organized disorder, the window that looked out over the east garden, and she let herself see them clearly, one last time, as things that had belonged to her. Then she stopped seeing them that way and got to work. She pulled her travel bag from under the bed. She was methodical about what she chose. Warm underlayers, because the north was cold, and she had no idea what the Obsidian Palace would provide. A second pair of shoes, the flat-soled ones she wore for long walks, solid and reliable. Her grandmother's ring, small and plain gold, wrapped in a scrap of cloth from the top drawer, where she had always kept it. 3 books. The Northern history she had been reading, a volume on trade law and negotiation she had worked through twice over the past year, and a slender book of old Northern folk stories she had borrowed from the market library 2 years ago and had always meant to return. A jar of peppermint balm for headaches. The small knife from her bedside table, not a weapon in any serious sense, just a habit she had developed from reading too many stories about women who ended up wishing they had kept something sharp. She changed into her warmest day dress and her dark wool coat. She tied her hair back. She sat on the edge of her bed with her bag at her feet and her hands quiet in her lap and waited. The soldiers arrived in 40 minutes. 2 of them, in black iron armor with the crown and thorns emblem. They were polite. One of them stood in the doorway and said, "Miss Voss," and stepped aside. She picked up her bag and went. At the base of the stairs, her mother was standing. Sarah stopped. Something in her chest tightened. For a moment she believed, she genuinely believed, in the way you believe in things against all available evidence, that her mother was going to speak, that she was going to say the words that had not been said in the study, the ones that should have come before the soldiers, before the signed paper, before 6 months of carefully kept silence. Her mother reached out and straightened the collar of Sarah's coat. Then she stepped back. Sarah held very still for one breath. Then she walked past her mother, through the front door, and out into the cold November night. The air hit her face with the smell of frost and the faint sweetness of the river 2 streets over. The black carriage waiting on the road had gold-trimmed lanterns on its sides, lit against the dark. It was a very good carriage. She noted this. Someone had thought about her comfort in transit, which meant she was worth something to whoever was waiting for her. A young soldier held the carriage door. She climbed in without assistance. The interior was cushioned and warm, a folded blanket on the opposite seat, a small compartment in the armrest, with 2 sealed cups and a wrapped portion of bread. The lanterns inside burned with a steady, clean light. A soldier sat across from her, young, not much older than she was, with the tired eyes of someone who had been working without adequate rest for some time. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the middle distance. The carriage began to move. "What is your name?" Sarah said. He looked at her. "Finn, miss." "How long is the journey to the Obsidian Court, Finn?" 3 days, if the road holds." "Is there anything you can tell me about what to expect when we arrive?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I can only tell you that the king does not harm new arrivals. Whatever you have heard about him, he does not hurt people unnecessarily." "That is a carefully chosen phrase," she said. He looked at his hands. "I am sorry, miss. It is honestly all I know." "I appreciate that you said it honestly," she told him, and meant it. The carriage moved through the streets of Calber. She watched through the small oval window as the familiar city passed by. The chandler on the corner of Harrow Street, the old fountain in the market square dry for winter, the front of the bookshop where she had spent nearly all of her pocket money over the past 8 years, the narrow bridge over the canal where children stood in summer to watch the barges. She watched all of it go. Then the city ended, and the road opened into dark countryside, and there was nothing but flat frost-pale ground on either side, and the thread of lantern light ahead. She thought about her father's face. She thought about Mira's exhaled breath. She thought about the way her mother's hands had felt adjusting her collar, firm, practiced, not trembling, and what that said about how long her mother had been preparing for this moment. She held all of it in her mind, and looked at it clearly, the way she looked at difficult problems in books, not looking away from the hard parts, not softening anything to make it more bearable. Her family had sold her. not to harm her perhaps. But they had sold her, and they had chosen her because she was the one they could sell, without losing anything they had decided mattered. That was the truth. She was going to live inside that truth, because pretending it was something else would only slow her down. Finn fell asleep after the first hour. She could not blame him. He was clearly exhausted, and the rhythm of the carriage on the packed road was the kind that invited drowsiness. He slumped against the carriage wall with his chin down, breathing slowly, and she was left alone with the sound of the wheels and the horses and the distant calls of the outriders. She reached into her bag and pulled out the volume on Northern Territorial history, tilting it toward the carriage lantern. The Obsidian Court had been the ruling seat of the Northern Territories for nearly 3 centuries, established after the Consolidation Wars when the various Packlord factions had finally united under a single ruling king. The current king had been on the throne for 11 years. She had read 2 short accounts of his rule. Both described him as effective and decisive. Neither had described him as kind. She had also heard the stories that were not in books. The market town was close enough to the northern trade road that travelers passed through regularly, and travelers talked. She had heard, over the years, versions of a story about the Alpha King that changed in its details depending on who was telling it, but remained consistent in its shape. That he had lost someone, that the loss had changed him, that whatever he had become after that loss was not entirely the man he had been before. She did not know what to make of those stories. People told dramatic tales about powerful men as a matter of habit. Half of it was probably embellishment, but she noted the parts that were consistent across multiple tellings and tucked them away. She was 20 years old. She had never been more than 2 towns from home. She had never had to fight for anything in her life that could not be solved by reading the right book or asking the right question. She was going to need more than that now. She looked out at the darkness and decided, quietly and firmly, that whatever came next, she would meet it with her eyes open and her spine straight. The town disappeared. She did not look back, even once. Finn fell asleep after the first hour. She could not blame him. The rhythm of the road was heavy, and the night was long, and whatever this journey meant to her, to him it was only another assignment. He slumped against the carriage wall with his chin tucked down, breathing slowly, and she was left alone with the sound of the wheels and the horses and the distant calls of the outriders riding in the dark beyond the lantern light. She opened her bag and took out the volume on Northern Territorial history, tilting the pages toward the carriage lantern. She read about the Alpha Line. The biology of it was different from anything she had encountered in the Southern accounts, which tended to either sensationalize it or dismiss it entirely, depending on the politics of the writer. The truth, as best she could assemble it from the dry language of the historical sources, was more ordinary and more fundamental than either extreme. The northern-born of the Alpha lineage were not monsters. They were not gods. They were people who felt the pull of their territory and their people, with an intensity that ordinary people did not, and whose stability, when it faltered, had consequences that extended outward into everything around them. She thought about what that meant for the man she was going to meet. She thought about what it meant that his stability had been slowly eroding for 3 years, and that the court had considered her a possible answer to that erosion, and that nobody had asked her any of this before signing her name to an agreement. She set the book down and looked out the window. The road was very dark. Occasionally the moon appeared between the clouds and laid a thin silver strip across the frost-pale ground, and then the clouds covered it again, and the dark came back. She watched this happen 3 times before she realized she had been watching it, and made herself look away. She was not afraid of the dark. She never had been. What she was, she understood with quiet precision, was uncertain, and uncertainty was simply a condition of having incomplete information, and incomplete information was something you addressed by gathering more. She would gather more. She would pay attention, and she would ask questions when questions were useful, and she would wait when waiting was useful. And somewhere in that process, she would find the shape of what she was dealing with, and then she would know what to do. That was all she knew how to do. It had always been enough before. She reached back into her bag and continued reading. By the time the sun came up, the world outside the carriage window looked nothing like home. The change had happened gradually, during the hours she had rested, with her eyes half closed. The flat farmland around Kalber giving way first to rougher pasture, then to denser forest, then to a long stretch of open highlands, where the frost made the ground look like hammered pewter, and the trees grew sparse and low. bent permanently sideways by the wind that came off the higher ridges to the northeast. Finn was awake again, slightly more rested but still quiet. One of the other riders had switched with him during the night, and was now resting across from her in his previous spot. An older soldier with gray at his temples and a long scar along his jawline that had healed poorly. He did not introduce himself, and she did not ask. She watched the landscape change. At mid-morning they stopped at a way station, a squat stone building at a crossroads, where a woman with a broad face and practical clothing brought out hot water for washing, and bowls of thick porridge without being asked. The soldiers moved efficiently, horses watered, gear checked, a brief exchange with the station keeper that Sarah did not hear clearly. She stood at the edge of the road and stretched her back and looked north. The ridgeline there was darker than anything she had seen in the south. Not the dark of trees or shadow, but the kind that came from the stone itself, which ran in long striations of near black through the hillsides, catching the flat winter light in a way that made the whole horizon look like something drawn in charcoal. First time going north? The voice belonged to a man she had not yet spoken to. Tall, lean, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of posture that came from years of military service, rather than any natural ease. He wore the same gray coat with the crown and thorns emblem, but the collar indicated a higher rank. He had the face of a man who did not waste expression on things that did not require it. Yes, she said. It changes fast from here, he said. He was looking at the same ridgeline. Most people notice it. What do I notice? He looked at her then, briefly. The air tastes different, heavier. Some people find it uncomfortable. Do they adjust? He considered this. Depends on the person. She looked back at the ridge. Commander? She guessed. Rail, he said, with the faint trace of something that was not quite amusement, but was related to it. Commander Rail. She filed the name. Commander Rail. The women who were sent before me. Where are they now? His face became carefully neutral in the way of a man who had been trained to give nothing away. They were returned to their families. Were they well? A pause. They were unharmed. She noted the precise word, but not well. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, in a tone that was not unkind, I would suggest not spending the next 2 days imagining the worst. I am not imagining anything, she said. I am gathering information. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, and walked back toward the way station. She ate her porridge. It was good, thick and slightly salted, with a spoonful of something dark and sweet stirred in. She did not waste it. They were back on the road within 20 minutes. The second day of travel was the strangest. The land north of the highlands had a quality she could not quite name. It was not threatening exactly, but it was present in a way that southern land was not, as though the ground itself was paying attention. The trees grew taller and closer together as the road wound downward from the ridge, enormous pines with trunks as wide as she could spread her arms, their branches interlocking overhead so that the road became a long green tunnel through which the winter light fell in slanted bars. The soldiers rode quietly. No one spoke much. Even the horses seemed to settle into a more careful, deliberate pace. At mid-afternoon, they passed through a village, a cluster of stone buildings around a well, with smoke rising from the chimneys and chickens picking in the frozen mud. A woman hanging laundry on a line near the road stopped and looked at the carriage passing. Then she looked at the emblem on the lead rider's coat and made a small motion with her hand, not a wave, something older than a wave, and turned back to her laundry. Finn was riding outside by then, but Sarah had pulled back the leather flap on the carriage window to feel the air, and she saw it. What was that? She asked, when he came to check on her at the next stop. He looked where she pointed, at the now distant village. Old custom, he said. When the crown passes. Does everyone do it? Everyone in the Northern Territories, yes. From fear or respect? He thought about this. Both, he said finally. It is hard to separate them, up here. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The second night they stopped at an inn, a larger one than the way station, with actual rooms for the soldiers and a separate room set aside for her on the upper floor. It was small but clean, with a proper bed and a candle in a holder on the sill, and a basin of water that was almost warm by the time she used it. She heard the soldiers talking downstairs through the thin boards of the floor. She caught pieces, a conversation about road conditions, about timing, about the state of the king's mood at court, that last one trailing off when one of the other men made some quieting gesture she could not see. She caught one sentence clearly, because the speaker had a carrying voice, and had forgotten, apparently, to lower it. Last one was there for 3 weeks before they sent her home. Did not speak for a month after, someone said. A lower voice responded, something she did not catch. 3 weeks is the shortest any of them lasted. Then it went quieter. She lay on the bed in her clothes and looked at the ceiling. 3 weeks. Not killed, but changed enough that the woman who went home was not quite the same as the one who had left. She made a list in her head, things she knew, things she did not know, things she needed to find out. The list of things she did not know was considerably longer, but it was a start. In the morning, they continued north, and the land changed again. The great pine forest thinned as the elevation rose, replaced by rocky open ground with low scrub vegetation that was gray-green even in winter, and above everything, the Black Mountains. She had read about them, but reading about a thing and seeing it were different. They were not dramatic in the way she had imagined. No jagged peaks or theatrical silhouettes. They were simply enormous, and dark, and permanent-looking, the way very old things look when they have been in one place long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. The road wound upward along a river valley. The water in the river ran clear and dark, moving fast over black stones. Commander Rail rode alongside the carriage for part of the afternoon. "What is he like?" she asked through the open flap. He looked at her without turning his horse's head. "That is a broad question." "Then give me a specific answer." He rode in silence for a moment. "He is honest. More than is comfortable, sometimes. He says exactly what he means, and he expects the same." "What does he mean about me?" "I do not know," he said. "He has not said." "But he agreed to me arriving." "He did not refuse," Rail said, which she noted was a different thing entirely. The valley widened late in the afternoon, and then the road bent around a long shoulder of hillside, and suddenly, without any further ceremony, the Obsidian Palace was visible. It was not what she had expected. She had imagined something dark and severe, tall towers, narrow windows, the sort of architecture that was meant to feel like a threat. But the palace was broad rather than tall, built from the same black-veined stone as the mountains behind it, with wide wings spreading outward from a central hall, and a long approach road lined with bare-limbed trees that in any other season must have been extraordinary. It sat at the head of the valley, with the mountains rising behind it, and it looked, despite itself, despite everything she had heard about it, like something that had grown there, rather than been built. She studied it as they drew closer, counted the windows on the front face, estimated the height of the central hall, noted where the gates were and what kind of structure flanked them, looked for lights in the upper stories, looked for movement in the outer corridors. People lived there. It was a living place. She had not expected that, somehow. The gates were already open when the convoy arrived, and they rode through without stopping. The outer yard was large, and paved in the same dark stone as the walls, and every surface was swept clean despite the cold. Stable hands came out immediately for the horses. The soldiers dismounted in practiced order. The carriage stopped. Commander Rail opened the door himself. She stepped out into the cold air of the Obsidian Court's outer yard and looked up at the palace. High above, on the gallery that ran the length of the second floor, several figures were watching. She could not make out faces at this distance, but she could see them clearly enough to know they were watching her in particular, not the convoy. She looked back up at them steadily, without expression. Then she turned toward the palace doors, adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and walked forward. She did not think much about what she had left behind, not that night, and not in the days that followed. This surprised her, though she did not show it. She had expected grief, or something like it, the familiar ache of loss that she knew from books and from the few significant losses she had actually experienced, her grandmother 2 years ago, a friendship that had quietly dissolved over a disagreement she still did not fully understand. But what she felt instead was something harder to name, a kind of cleanness, as though certain things she had been carrying for years had been put down when she picked up the travel bag, and she had not yet noticed the weight difference because the novelty of being without them was still new. She thought this might change. She thought the grief might arrive later, in a different form, the way pain sometimes delays its arrival when the body is too occupied with immediate events to accommodate it. She noted the possibility and set it aside. She would deal with it when it came. What she could not set aside, and did not try to, was the curiosity. The Obsidian Palace, the Alpha King, a court that had proposed this arrangement, and a man who had not refused it. A world she had only ever read about from a distance, described by writers who were mostly writing about things they had not seen either, assembling their accounts from other accounts, the inaccuracies compounding with each retelling, until what remained was half rumor and half something else entirely. She was going to see it herself. That was, she realized, somewhere in the second hour of the journey, perhaps the first time in her life that something genuinely new was going to happen to her. She had been, until now, a person who lived mostly in the space between known things. Not unhappily, but within limits she had not chosen, and had not, until now, had reason to question. She turned to a new chapter in the history book and read on. The doors of the Obsidian Palace opened before she reached them. Not dramatically. Not with a great grinding of hinges, or the kind of theatrical slowness meant to impress arriving guests. They were simply opened by two attendants in gray livery, who stepped back against the walls and watched her walk past, with expressions that revealed nothing at all. Inside was warmer than she expected. Stone floors the color of charcoal, worn smooth by what must have been decades or centuries of feet crossing them. High ceilings with iron chandeliers, lit with dozens of candles that cast a steady gold light across everything. Long tapestries on the walls, not battles as she had expected, but landscapes. The valley as it must look in summer, the mountains at sunrise, the river in flood, the great pine forest in winter. Someone had chosen those deliberately, she thought. Someone who wanted the rooms to feel, if not welcoming, then at least not hostile. A woman was waiting just inside the doors, young, perhaps 3 or 4 years older than Sarah, with brown skin, a serious face, and dark hair pulled back in a tight braid. She wore a plain gray dress, with the crown and thorns emblem, embroidered at the cuff in darker thread. She did not bow or curtsy. She simply looked at Sarah with her hands folded in front of her and said, "I am Elke. I have been assigned to you." "Assigned how?" Sarah asked. "I will take care of your rooms, meals, clothing requirements, anything you need to know about the palace routines." A pause, "and to answer your questions where I am permitted to." The qualifier was interesting. "Where you are permitted to," Sarah repeated. "Yes. Who sets the limits on that?" Elke did not answer, which was itself an answer of a kind. "All right," Sarah said. "Thank you, Elke." Something faint crossed Elke's face. Not quite surprise, not quite warmth, but something adjacent to both, as though she had prepared herself for a different opening. "This way," she said. They walked. The palace was even larger from the inside than it had appeared from the approach road. Long corridors opened into wider halls and narrower passages. Stairways rose and split. Windows looked out onto interior courtyards that were themselves the size of the Voss family's entire front property. She kept track of the turns as best she could, left at the second stair, right at the carved archway, straight through the gallery, with the stone-floored overlook, building a rough map in her head that she already knew she would need to revise. Other people moved through the corridors, court staff mostly, in the gray livery, women with linen bundles, men carrying covered trays, attendants crossing from one passage to another, with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew exactly where they were going. A few of them looked at Sarah. Most looked away quickly. One did not look away. A woman standing at the far end of a wide gallery, dressed in a deep blue that was clearly not staff livery, with fair hair arranged in careful waves and jewelry chosen to be noticed, looked at Sarah with an expression so calculated in its blankness that it was itself a clear message. She was beautiful in an arranged, deliberate way, and she was looking at Sarah the way a person looks at an inconvenience they have already decided how to handle. Sarah held her gaze without any particular expression. Then she walked on. "Lady Iveth," Elke murmured, not turning her head. "Court noble, second tier. Is she influential?" A brief pause. "She believes so." Sarah filed this away. They stopped in front of a pair of tall double doors at the end of a long corridor on the ground floor. The doors were black wood, plain, with iron handles. Guards stood on either side, still, professional, eyes forward. "The king is inside," Elke said. "The court is assembled." Sarah straightened her coat. checked the strap of her bag, breathed. "All right," she said. The guards opened the doors. The throne room was not what the rest of the palace had suggested it would be. Where the corridors were warm lit and almost inviting, the throne room was spare. Very high ceiling, plain stone walls without tapestry, cold light from windows set near the top of the walls that let in gray winter light from outside. The only warmth came from two long fireplaces along the side walls, which gave enough light to see by but not enough to soften the room's atmosphere. The court was assembled in 2 rows along either wall, perhaps 40 people in total, nobles and senior staff and figures in military dress. They were all looking at her. She could feel the weight of it, the collective assessment. She walked forward. She did not hurry. She did not slow. She found a pace that was neither submission nor performance, and maintained it, keeping her eyes on the far end of the room, where the throne sat, on a raised step of dark stone. The man in the throne was not looking at her. He was reading something, a document held in one hand, his elbow resting on the arm of the chair. He was dressed plainly for a king, a dark coat without decoration, except for a single emblem at the chest, no crown, no ceremonial clothing. He was tall even seated, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of face that had strong architecture, a jaw, a brow, but had been lived in hard enough that the architecture had become secondary to the map of experience drawn over it. A scar along his jaw, pale and clean. Another on the back of his left hand, which was visible where it rested against the arm of the chair. He looked up when she was 10 feet away. His eyes were gray. Not the pale gray of a winter sky, but the deeper gray of stone before rain, a color with density to it. They held her face for a moment with an expression she could not quite locate. Not interest exactly, not hostility. More the careful attention of someone checking whether a thing is what they were told it was. She stopped and waited. He looked at her for another moment. Then he raised one hand, a simple gesture, and said to the room at large, "Leave." No further instruction, no qualification. The court left, quickly, without protest, with the practiced movement of people who had been given that instruction often enough to know it was not negotiable. 40 people filed out through various doors she had not noticed, and within 2 minutes the room was empty, except for her, and the 2 guards at the main doors behind her, and the king in his chair. He set down the document he had been reading. He looked at her, without the particular pressure of the assembled court behind him, and without it, he looked different. Not smaller, but less performed, as though the audience had required something of him that he was now, quietly, setting down. "Your name," he said. Not a question, a request. "Sarah Voss," she said. He repeated it, just the words, no expression on them. Testing the sound, she thought, the way you say a word in a language you are learning, to see how it sits in the mouth. He stood up. He was taller than she had estimated from the doorway. He moved the way people move when they are accustomed to large amounts of space, not careless, but unencumbered. He stepped off the raised floor and walked toward her, and she kept herself very still, because every nerve in her body understood that he was something she had never been near before, something with a different quality to the air around it, and the instinct was to step back. She did not step back. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her, the way he had been looking at the document, with the full, focused weight of his attention, not unkindly, but completely. She had the unsettling sensation of being read. Then he walked around her slowly. Once, she let him. When he was in front of her again, his expression had shifted slightly. Something had eased in it, or perhaps settled, as though whatever question he had come to check had returned an answer he had not been sure of getting. "You are not frightened," he said. "I am," she said honestly. "But I am also here, so." Something crossed his face. Not a smile, but the place a smile would be in a person who smiled more easily. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the step. "You will have rooms in the west wing," he said, with his back to her. "You will have access to the grounds from the eastern exit, the library on the 2nd floor, and the dining hall at mealtimes. There are corridors you will be asked not to enter. Elka will tell you which ones." "All right," she said. "If you do not attempt to run," he said, "you will not be harmed." "And if I do?" she said. He paused. He did not turn around. He was quiet for a moment, that was just long enough to be deliberate. "I would suggest not finding out," he said. He sat back down in the throne and picked up his document. She stood in the middle of the spare, cold room for a moment and looked at him. He looked, she thought, exhausted, not physically tired. His posture was straight, his movement had been sure and controlled, but something behind his eyes carried the weight of a person who had been managing something enormous for a very long time, with no reliable place to put it down. She thought about what the soldier at the inn had said. 3 weeks was the shortest any of them lasted. She was not going to leave in 3 weeks. She turned and walked back toward the doors, and the guards opened them, and Elke was waiting in the corridor outside. "Your rooms," Elke said, and walked. Sarah followed. Her rooms were in the west wing, a sitting room and a sleeping room, and a narrow room off the side that served as a dressing space. The furniture was good, dark wood and practical, and someone had put a vase of dried winter flowers on the desk in the sitting room. The windows looked out over the western courtyard, which was enclosed and tree-lined and empty in the cold. She set her bag on the desk and looked around. Elke stood in the doorway. "Dinner is at the 7th bell," she said. "I can bring it to your rooms if you prefer." "I will eat in the dining hall," Sarah said. A pause. "The court will be present." "That is fine," Sarah said. Elke looked at her for a moment. Then she made a small nod, not servile but considering, and said, "I will come for you at the 6th bell," and left. Sarah went to the window. The western courtyard was still and winter bare, the tree branches tracing bare lines against a sky that was deepening toward dark blue as the afternoon came to its end. She could hear, very faintly, the sound of the palace around her, movement in other corridors, a distant bell, the low sound of voices somewhere below. She was here, she was alive, she was unharmed. Now she needed to figure out what everything meant. She pulled the Northern History from her bag and sat down in the chair by the window, and she began to read. That first night in the palace, she sat by her window for a long time after Elke had gone, watching the western courtyard fill with moonlight. She thought about the king's face. She had been trained by years of reading to analyze what faces revealed and concealed, to note the difference between a person who was hiding something and a person who was simply controlled, who had learned to keep the surface calm so that whatever moved underneath could be managed rather than displayed. He was the second type. She was certain of that. Underneath the contained surface was something that had been through a great deal, something that had survived things she did not yet know about, and the survival had left marks on it, the way long weather leaves marks on stone. She thought about what he had said. If you do not attempt to run, you will not be harmed. Not a threat. Or not only a threat. She had turned it over in her mind during the walk back through the corridors, and what she had concluded was that it was also something else. Something closer to the speech of a man setting out terms as clearly as he was able to, because clarity was what he had to offer in the absence of comfort. She appreciated that, in a strange and sideways fashion. She unfolded the blanket at the foot of her bed and sat on the edge of the mattress. The room was quiet, in a way that palace rooms apparently were. A deep institutional quiet that was different from the quiet of a private house, held in place by thick walls and thick floors and a great deal of stone between her and the world outside. She thought about Elke, about the careful, closed way she moved through spaces, the precision of her helpfulness, the way she had looked at Sarah when Sarah said thank you and seemed, briefly, to not know where to put the acknowledgement. A person who had learned that warmth was a luxury that cost more than she had available to spend. Sarah had met a few people like that over the years. They were not unfriendly once you understood the language they were using. She would learn Elke's language. She lay back on the bed in her clothes and looked at the ceiling and listened to the palace settle around her into the particular quiet of very late at night, and she breathed slowly, and she let herself rest. She did not sleep for a long time, but the resting was enough. The days settled into shape, the way days always do, when the first shock of a new place fades and reality moves in. Sarah had been in the Obsidian Palace for 3 weeks. She knew the layout of the West Wing completely, every corridor, every door, which ones were always unlocked and which required a key she did not have. She knew the kitchen schedule well enough to arrive at the dining hall at the precise moment when the bread was fresh and the soup was still hot. She knew the guards' rotation on the eastern exit, which meant she knew exactly when she could walk in the gardens alone for 40 minutes, without anyone following at too close a distance. She was building the map of this place in her head, the way she had always built maps of complicated things. Piece by piece, without rushing, without assuming she understood a section before she had walked it enough times to be certain. The palace was not what she had expected in several important ways. It was not a place of fear. Or not entirely. There was tension in it. She could feel it in the way staff moved through certain corridors faster than others, in the way conversations paused when specific names were mentioned, in the particular silence that fell over the dining hall on the 2 occasions when the king himself had entered and taken his seat at the high table without announcement. But underneath the tension was something else, the ordinary, worn rhythm of a place that had been inhabited for a long time by people who were just trying to do their work. The cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Clara who ran the kitchens with the unhurried authority of someone who understood that she held more actual power than most of the courtiers, had nodded at Sarah on the 3rd morning and said, without preamble, "You eat everything that is put in front of you. Good." This was apparently the highest form of praise available in Clara's vocabulary, and Sarah accepted it accordingly. The head groundskeeper was an old man named Hugh, who spent most of his time in the western tool rooms, and whose opinion on the East Garden's drainage problem, she had discovered, was thorough and strongly held. He had begun explaining it to her on her 2nd week, simply because she had happened to be standing near the East Garden gate when he arrived, with a complaint about the frost damage, and she had asked a question, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man who had been hoping someone would ask that exact question for quite some time. This was how she made progress, she had found, not by pushing, but by asking, by being genuinely interested and letting people discover that she was. The exception was Elka. Elka did her job with complete efficiency and no warmth that Sarah could identify. She appeared at the correct times, completed the correct tasks, answered questions about palace routines with accuracy and no elaboration, and was otherwise a closed door, not unfriendly. She was not cold in the way that Lady Iveth was cold, which was the cold of deliberate contempt. Elka was closed in the way of a person who had learned, through some experience, that openness was a cost they could not currently afford. Sarah respected this. She did not push, but she did, quietly, begin to make space for the possibility of something different. She said thank you when Elka brought her morning tea, and meant it. She asked once, just once, whether Elka had been assigned to this position, or had chosen it, and when Elka had said, assigned, she had simply nodded and not followed it up. She made a point of not treating Elka as though she were invisible, and she made a point of not treating her as though she were a project either. Progress was slow, but progress was being made. The one place in the palace she had not yet been able to fully explore was the eastern wing. She had reached it twice, by different routes, both times arriving at a cross corridor that was flagged, not with a door or a lock, but with a subtle change in the floor. The stone there was lighter, as though it had been replaced at some point, and the light from the corridor lanterns did not reach far enough to see what was beyond. There was no guard stationed at the entrance. There did not need to be. The whole quality of the air near that corridor was different. Not threatening, but heavy, the way a room feels when something has happened in it that is not quite finished happening yet. She did not go down it. She would, eventually. But she was not ready yet, and she had learned that patience was not weakness when used correctly. Lady Iveth made her move on the 22nd day. It happened in the gallery that ran along the upper hall, a long room with windows on one side and a series of portraits on the other, which Sarah had been using as a place to read in the afternoons when the light was good. She had been there for an hour when Iveth arrived with 2 other women in similar dress, all 3 of them moving with the particular ease of people who were accustomed to controlling the character of any room they entered. Iveth stood in the middle of the gallery and looked at Sarah with a smile that had been constructed to resemble something warm. "Still reading," she said. "You must find it very useful." "I do," Sarah said, without looking up from the page. "The previous women who came here found it important to engage with the court," Iveth said. "It is expected." "By whom?" Sarah said. A small pause. "By everyone." Sarah looked up then. She looked at Iveth directly, and held her gaze with the same pleasant, neutral expression she would use when asking a trade representative to clarify a discrepancy in their account. "I will keep that in mind," she said, and looked back down at her book. There was a moment of silence, in which Sarah could feel Iveth recalibrating. "It would be a shame," Iveth said, "if the king found you unsociable." I had breakfast in the dining hall this morning, Sarah said, turning a page. Spoke with the court archivist for 20 minutes about the water rights dispute along the Eastern River. Spent an hour with Hugh, reviewing the spring garden schedule. She looked up again. Was there something specific you needed, Lady Iveth? Iveth's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes shifted in a way that said she had revised her assessment and would be taking a different approach the next time. Enjoy your afternoon, she said, and left. The two women who had come with her exchanged a look as they followed. One of them, the taller one, glanced back at Sarah with an expression that might have been the beginning of something like respect. That evening, Sarah found the library. She had known it existed. Elke had mentioned it on the first day as one of the spaces she was permitted to use. But she had not found it yet because it was accessed through a corridor she had not yet mapped. It was on the second floor of the central wing, behind a door that looked like part of the wall, and was identified only by the fact that it had a handle, where a handle had no business being. Inside was a room 3 times the size of the largest room in the Voss family home, with bookshelves that ran from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and a 4th wall that was entirely windows overlooking the inner courtyard. The books were well organized and very numerous. There were several chairs arranged near the windows, and a long table with a standing lamp, and the air smelled of paper and old wood and something faintly of pine resin from the beams in the ceiling. She stood in the middle of it and felt something loosen in her chest for the first time since she had arrived. She chose a chair by the window and sat. Below, the inner courtyard was lit by a single iron lantern, and the stones were dusted faintly with the light frost that had come in the past 2 nights. She had been there for perhaps 20 minutes, reading a collection of northern legal texts she had pulled from the shelves, when she became aware that someone else was in the room. She looked up. The king was standing at the far window. He was not looking at her. He was looking out at the courtyard, one hand in his pocket, standing in the way he apparently stood when no one was watching him present himself to anything. Differently. More still. Less like a king and more like a person. He must have come in while she was reading. She had not heard the door. She looked at him for a moment, then returned to her page. He stayed for several minutes. Then, without speaking, he walked out. She did not call after him. She did not follow. But she thought about it, the way he had stood at that window, the particular quality of his stillness, for the rest of the evening and part of the night. Then, 4 days later, the storm came. It arrived fast, the way northern storms apparently did. The sky simply changed, and within an hour, the courtyard outside her window was invisible behind a wall of moving white. She had been reading when she heard it start, and instead of staying inside the way common sense suggested, she had put on her coat and walked out through the eastern exit and stood in the courtyard as the snow came down. She could not have explained why, except that it seemed important to do something she chose for no reason except wanting to. The snow was heavy and fast, and within a few minutes her coat was dusted with it, and her hair was wet, and the cold was genuine. She did not care. She stood with her face up and felt the flakes land on her eyelashes, and the cold fill her lungs, and just existed, outside of the palace, outside of her situation, in the simple fact of the storm. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. The king was standing at the edge of the exit, in his coat, looking at her with that expression she was slowly learning to read, the one that was not quite anything, but was paying careful attention. "There is a storm," he said. "Yes," she said. "You are outside in it." "Yes." He looked at her. The snow was falling between them. His dark hair was quickly going white with it. "Why?" he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "Because I wanted to," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, to her considerable surprise, he walked out and stood next to her in the snow. They stood there together in silence for perhaps 5 minutes, both of them looking up at the gray and white sky, until the cold became too serious to ignore. Then, without discussion, they walked back inside. He went one direction and she went the other. She went back to the library and sat down and thought, for a long moment, about the fact that he had come out into a storm for no stated reason, and stood beside her in silence. She felt, strangely, slightly less alone than she had an hour ago. She was not sure what to do with that. She picked up her book and kept reading. Hugh, she had come to understand, was perhaps the most honest person in the palace. Not because he was a particularly virtuous man, though she thought he probably was, in the plain-faced way of people who had simply never seen the point of being otherwise, but because he had spent 37 years caring for things that could not be deceived. Plants did not respond to politics. The East Garden's drainage problem did not care about who held which council seat. The frost damage was the frost damage, and you dealt with it directly or you lost the plants. He had developed, over those 37 years, a habit of speaking plainly that sat in the palace like a piece of furniture from a different era, slightly mismatched with everything around it, and completely reliable. She spent Tuesday afternoons with him when her schedule permitted. They talked about the garden, mostly, and about the grounds more broadly, and occasionally about the history of the palace's relationship with the land it sat on, which was longer and more complicated than she had expected, and which Hugh had opinions about. But sometimes, in the comfortable way of conversations that have established their own rhythm, they talked about other things. It was Hugh who told her about the East Wing, without her being the one to ask. He simply mentioned it one afternoon, while they were looking at the frost damage to the border plantings along the eastern wall, that the East Wing had been closed for nearly 3 years, that the king had ordered the rooms there sealed, and the corridor flagged the month after. After what? She had asked. Hugh had looked at the frozen ground for a long moment. After the queen died, he said, and went back to examining the plants, and she had understood that she was not going to get more than that from him today, and had filed it away and not pushed. She was learning, in this place, that the most important information arrived sideways, not from direct questions, but from the accumulation of small things observed over time, from the way a corridor smelled different from other corridors, from the way a man who talked freely about drainage problems went quiet at a particular name. She was building a picture from these sideways arrivals, adding to it each day, and it was becoming more detailed and more clear. She was beginning to understand where she was, and she was beginning to understand that she was not going to leave it. Elke told her on a Tuesday. It had been building for several days. Sarah could feel it. There were pauses in Elke's movements that had not been there before, slight hesitations at the door when she came in the mornings, the way she looked at Sarah sometimes when she thought Sarah was not paying attention, the look of a person carrying something they have decided, perhaps without consciously choosing, that they are going to share. The moment came when Sarah was dressing after her morning walk. Elke was folding a set of linens at the other end of the room, and Sarah said, without any particular lead-up, "You do not have to keep protecting me from information, Elke." Elke's hands stilled on the linen. "I know you have been told not to tell me things," Sarah continued, tying the lace at her cuff. "But I am going to find things out one way or another, and I would rather hear them from you, because you would tell me accurately." She looked over at Elke. "Whatever you are holding on to." Elke set the linen down and was quiet for a long moment. Then she sat down in the chair by the window, not the way she usually positioned herself in Sarah's rooms, which was always near the door, always at a slight distance, but properly, with her hands in her lap, as though she had decided something. Her name was Thessaly, she said. Sarah sat down across from her and listened. The queen, Caelendrath's chosen companion, the woman he had bound himself to not through arrangement, but through the deep bond that the Alpha-born sometimes formed, had come to court at 18 as part of a diplomatic visit from the Western Territories, and had simply never gone home. Not because she was kept, but because she chose to stay, and the king had changed around her, slowly, entirely, in the way a place changes when the right conditions finally arrive. They had been together for 6 years. 3 years ago, during a formal procession through the lower city, an assassin had been waiting in the crowd. The shot had been aimed at Caelan. Thessaly had been standing slightly forward of him on the carriage step, pointing something out to a child who had called her name. She had died before they reached the palace. The investigation had named 3 men as responsible. Hired men, paid by unknown parties. 2 had been caught. 1 had never been found. The investigation had stalled. The court had watched the king in the months that followed. Elke described this carefully. Not the dramatic break that the stories in the South embellished, but a slow, grinding erosion. He had continued to rule. He had not stopped making decisions, signing orders, appearing in formal settings. But something in the governing of himself had become effortful in a way it had not been before. The control that had been natural became managed. The ease had gone out of him, and in its place was a kind of relentless maintenance that took everything he had. The Obsidian Court had an alpha line. If the king's stability failed entirely, the line would have to be contested. That could not happen. The Northern Territories had spent 300 years in political unity, and the factions waiting to capitalize on a power gap were neither kind nor careful about what they were willing to do. The High Council had proposed the tribute arrangement, a companion, not a replacement for a mate, that was not something that could be forced, but a grounding presence, a person to occupy some of the space that had become too empty. Kaelin had refused the first 5 candidates the council presented, refused them outright, before they arrived. The 6th had come before he could block the arrangement in time, and she had been in the palace for 3 weeks before asking to leave. He had let her go without any response at all, according to Elke, which had disturbed the court in its own way. He agreed to me arriving, Sarah said. Did he not? Elke was quiet for a moment. He did not refuse. Sarah thought about this. But he did not choose me either. No, but he has not sent you away. How long did the others stay? Specifically. Elke answered carefully. 9 days, 12 days, 11 days, 3 days, 4 days, 3 weeks. Why did they leave? Sarah said. Were they frightened? Mostly, Elke said. The court can be difficult. The court made their position clear, that they were unwanted, temporary, not suitable. She paused. Lady Iveth was particularly effective at making people feel that. Sarah thought about the gallery, about Iveth's smile, and the calculation behind it. She understood now, what she had only half understood then. Who is behind the tribute arrangement? She asked. On the council? Elke hesitated. Lord Osran chairs the council. He proposed the arrangement initially. Is he the one who wants me gone? Elke looked at her hands. Lord Osran wants what he has always wanted, to maintain his position on the council. A stabilized king serves that purpose. A king who forms an actual attachment to someone from outside the court's preferred circles does not. Sarah processed this. So I am meant to be a solution that does not actually solve anything. You are meant to stabilize him enough that the council retains control, Elke said quietly, and then remain manageable. And the previous women who left? Elke met her eyes, were encouraged to leave, by the court, before anything became complicated. Sarah held this for a moment, the full shape of it. The previous women had not been frightened of the king. They had been pushed out by the court that was supposed to be welcoming them, chipped away at, until they felt too small to remain, and then returned to their families with something essential quieted in them. She felt something then, not quite anger, not the burning kind, the steadier kind, the kind that had a long duration. Thank you, she said to Elke, for telling me. Elke looked at her. What are you going to do? Nothing drastic, Sarah said. Not yet. That evening, she was eating dinner alone in the dining hall, when the door opened, and she looked up to find the king crossing the room. He stopped when he saw her. She did not look away. After a moment, he sat down at the table, not at the far end, but several chairs closer than strictly necessary, and a staff member appeared with food and set it before him, and he began to read a document. They ate in silence for some time. Then he said, without looking up, "Are you afraid of me?" She considered this seriously, because it was a serious question. I was, when I arrived, she said. I am less afraid now. Why less? Because you have had ample opportunity to be frightening and have mostly just been present, she said. A pause. He turned a page. Most people find the presence itself frightening. I find it clarifying, she said. You are not performing anything. What I see is what there is. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that is not a common observation. No, she said. I imagine not. He looked up. Then, just briefly, just long enough to meet her eyes with an expression she could not fully read. Then he looked back down at his document. You ask questions no one else asks, he said. Is that a problem? No, he said. And something in the way he said it, flat and direct, and with no qualifying warmth but entirely genuine, made her feel, strangely, more certain of where she stood than any reassurance would have. I will be in the library after dinner, she said, if you meant to continue the conversation. He did not respond. She finished her meal and went to the library. He was there an hour later, standing at the shelf in the far corner, with a book open in his hand. He did not sit, but he stayed for 2 hours, reading in the same room, And once, just once, he asked her what she was working through, and she told him about the northern legal texts, and he said 3 sentences about the case she had been puzzling over, that reframed it entirely, and confirmed her half-formed guess about the resolution. She did not thank him excessively. She just said, "Yes, that makes sense," and went back to reading. He was still there when she said goodnight and left. She walked back to her rooms through the quiet corridors, and felt, for the first time, something that was not quite hope, but was in the same family as it. A sense that the shape of things here was not yet fixed, that it was still in the process of becoming, and that she was part of what would determine what it became. That was enough, for now. She thought about it all that night, lying in the dark with the window cracked slightly open to let in the cold air that had become, over the weeks, something she needed to sleep properly. The previous women had not been broken by the king. She had half feared that, despite herself, despite all the evidence she had assembled that pointed the other way. She had read enough history to know that men with power used it, and that the historical record tended to soften what that use had looked like in practice. But Elke's account was clear and specific in the way of true accounts. The women had not been harmed. They had been worn down by the court, chipped at and dismissed, and excluded, until they felt the impossibility of remaining somewhere they were so comprehensively unwanted. And then they had gone. She understood this. She understood it because she had felt the beginning of it herself, in the gallery with Lady Iveth, in the moments before she had looked up from her book and decided that she was not going to perform the smallness that was being expected of her. The difference between her and the women who had left was not courage. She did not think it was courage. She thought it was information. The previous women had not known what they were dealing with. They had seen the court's rejection of them as a reflection of the king's will, as his choice being communicated through the people around him, and they had concluded that they were unwanted and gone. She now knew that the rejection had been a strategy, a manufactured hostility, designed to drive her out before anything about her presence became inconvenient to the men who were managing the king's court in his name. That changed everything. If they needed her gone, she was doing something right by being here. She turned onto her side and looked at the thin line of moonlight under the window, and felt, quietly and with great precision, the particular clarity of understanding what the game actually was. She could play this game. She had been playing games of information and patience and careful attention her entire life, in smaller rooms, against lesser stakes. She was not going to leave. The summit was announced 7 days in advance. Lords from 3 territories would be coming to the Obsidian Court to discuss border arrangements, resource-sharing agreements, and the situation along the Northern River, where 2 seasons of irregular flooding had been causing disputes that had, in 2 instances, escalated from arguments to incidents, requiring military mediation. The palace preparations began immediately. Extra staff, additional horses, rooms in the East Wing opened for the first time in months. Sarah heard about it from Clara in the kitchens, where she had developed the habit of appearing on Tuesday mornings when the week's provisions were being organized, and Clara was in her most expansive mood. 6 extra lords and their retinues, Clara said, surveying a delivery of winter roots with the practiced eye of a woman pricing everything simultaneously. I have done 15 of these summits in this palace. They all end the same way. Too much wine, too little agreement, and a lot of noise about things that get decided in the 3rd week anyway. Do they usually stay 3 weeks? Sarah asked. The paperwork takes that long, yes. Clara looked at her. Stay out of the formal dining room during the first night. That is when they test things. Test what things? Each other, Clara said, and went back to counting the root vegetables. Elke explained the protocol. The lords would arrive over 2 days. There would be a formal welcome dinner the 2nd evening, and Sarah was expected to be present in the dining hall for it. Not at the high table, not at first, but in the hall, visible. Is that usual? Sarah said. For someone in my position? Elke said, carefully. The previous women were usually escorted to their rooms on formal occasions. Whose decision was that? Lord Osran arranged the guest lists. Sarah looked at Elke. I will be at the welcome dinner, she said. Elke's expression shifted slightly. Yes, she said. I thought so. The lords arrived over the course of the first day. 4 from the Eastern River territories, and 2 from the western border. One of the western lords was a man named Varon, Lord Varon Ashby, and Sarah noticed him before he had dismounted from his horse, because he was the kind of man who arranged himself to be noticed. He was handsome, with a deliberate quality to his appearance, and he moved through the outer yard greeting other arrivals with the easy authority of someone who had decided long ago that every room he entered was his to command. He also, she noticed, looked toward her room's wing of the palace with the speculative expression of someone doing a calculation. She did not like that. The welcome dinner was held in the great hall. The court was assembled in their finest. The visiting lords sat in order of precedence. Kaelin was at the head. Sarah sat 3 places down on the left side, between the court archivist, whom she knew and liked, and a quiet young lord from the Eastern Territories, whose name she had not yet caught. She ate and listened, and paid careful attention to the room. Lord Varen was watching her. Not constantly, not obviously, but she felt the weight of it in the particular way she felt things that were being directed at her, and were not meant to look like it. She caught it twice, during the first course, and then during the dessert, and both times, she held his gaze calmly, until he looked away. The third time, he did not look away. He leaned back in his chair, and addressed her across the table, with the particular brand of effortless dismissal that requires significant effort to perfect. "I did not know there was an offering in residence," he said, not to her, to the table generally, in the tone of someone making a mildly interesting observation about the decor. "What is it, the third, the fourth?" The table went quiet. Kaelin's expression did not change. Sarah set down her fork. "I am Sarah Voss," she said, pleasantly. "I do not believe you have mentioned your name yet." "Varen Ashby," he said, still barely to her. "Western Border Territory." "Lord Ashby," she said, "I understand you represent the 2 Western Territories along the Shale River." A slight shift in his posture. "Among other concerns." "Then you will be familiar with the Shale River Compact," she said. "The 1889 agreement." A pause, generally. The Western lords who signed it agreed to limit independent resource extraction along the northern 40 miles to rotational schedules, to prevent the flooding that had caused problems in the previous 2 decades. She picked up her fork again. "The reason I mention it is that the flooding this season along the eastern edge appears to be directly related to a break in that rotation by one of the Western Territories, specifically, a change in the drainage cut schedule made last spring." The table was very quiet now. Lord Varen's easy expression had developed a slight difficulty around the edges. "I am not certain that is correct." "The Eastern Lords have the survey records," she said, nodding down the table toward the men who were now looking at her with considerable interest. "I have read them. The discrepancy begins in the 3rd week of April. The decision would have been made at a territory level, which means someone in your court approved it." She looked at him directly. "So I would be careful about how you position yourself at this table, Lord Ashby, because the people who need to agree with you over the next 3 weeks have very clear records of what happened." Varen looked at her. Something had gone out of his expression, not the arrogance exactly, but the ease behind it. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said, and ate her dinner. The table gradually resumed its conversation. The young lord to her left had gone very still, with the particular quality of someone trying not to react visibly to something they found remarkable. She glanced toward the head of the table. Kaelin was looking at her. Not with surprise, not exactly. More with the expression of a man who has just been given information he is still processing, that has rearranged something in the structure of what he knew. She looked back at her food. That night, she was in the library at the late hour, when she heard the door open. She did not look up. Kaelin's footstep was distinctive. She had learned it. Not heavy, but deliberate. Each step exactly where it was meant to be. He sat in the chair across from her, which he had not done before. He had always taken the window, or the far shelves. She looked up. He was looking at her, with the direct, careful attention she had come to recognize as what he used when something mattered to him. "Where did you learn about the Shale River Compact?" he said. "Legal texts," she said. "Second shelf from the left, Northern River Law section, and trade law from my father's library." He dealt with enough river merchants that it came up. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The man who put that compact together in 1889. "Your grandfather," she said. "Yes, I know. I read the signatory page." Something shifted in his face, slowly, as though a weight he had been holding had moved to a slightly different position. "Thessaly was the only other person who ever read those books," he said. She was very still. He looked at the window. Outside, the inner courtyard was dark and cold. He was quiet for a long time, and she did not fill the silence, because some silences need to be honored. She died 3 years ago, he said, finally. I imagine you know. I imagine everyone has told you by now. Elka told me, she said. I am sorry. He looked at his hands. She was not afraid of anything, he said, which was not always convenient. She said exactly what she thought. She read everything she could get her hands on. She was herself. He paused. He pressed his mouth into a line. Completely herself, all the time. I had never known anyone who did that before her. Sarah listened. She did not move. I have not spoken about her to anyone in this palace, he said, since the week after the funeral. You do not have to now, if you would rather not, she said. I know, he said. And something in his face, not grief, not relief, but some third thing that existed between the two, opened slightly. Like a door that has been closed for so long it no longer opens all the way, but opens enough to let the air through. He stayed in the library until the candles burned low. When he left, he paused at the door and said, without turning, You were right about Varon Ashby. He knew about the drainage schedule. I know, she said. He blinked at the 3rd week of April. A pause. Then, very quietly, Good night, Sarah. It was the first time he had used her name without first repeating it. Good night, she said. She listened to his footsteps disappear down the corridor. Something had shifted between them, that evening. She could feel it in the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not dramatic, not sudden, but real, and going in one direction, and not going back. The summit proceedings resumed 2 days after the welcome dinner, with a different quality to them. Lord Varon Ashby had not referred to Sarah's position again. He had, in fact, been notably careful about how he spoke to anyone at the high table, which the Eastern lords appeared to find quietly satisfying. The drainage schedule discrepancy had become the central technical issue of the first week, which meant the visiting lords were spending their mornings in detailed discussion of survey data, and their afternoons drafting proposed revision frameworks. And this was, Sarah reflected, rather more productive than 15 similar summits had apparently managed in the past. She attended the working sessions when she was permitted to, and sat quietly in the gallery above the chamber when she was not, and read the summaries that Rael brought her with the flat reliability of a man who had decided that keeping her informed was part of his job now regardless of whether anyone had told him so. On the 3rd day of the summit proper, she was in the archive room looking for a secondary reference on the 1889 River Compact, when she found something she had not been looking for. It was a set of property transfer documents, filed under a cross-reference she would not have thought to check if she had not been reaching past it for the compact records. The transfers were old, originating 30 years ago, and she would not have looked at them at all except that one of the family names in the chain of ownership was the same family name as one of Lord Osran's mother's relatives, a name she had seen only once before in passing in the genealogical notes at the back of a territorial history. She sat down at the archive table and read the documents carefully. Then she read them again. Then she put them back in their place very precisely and walked back to her rooms, with her hands folded behind her back, and her mind working through the implications with the quiet, focused intensity of someone who has just found the first thread of something much larger than it initially appeared. She said nothing to anyone that day, but she had begun. The morning after the summit's opening dinner, Lord Osran began watching her differently. She noticed it the way she noticed most things. Not with alarm, but with the cool attention of someone who has learned that the first sign of a threat is often a change in how a person looks at you. Before, Osran had looked at her the way he looked at the other decorative elements of the court, noting her presence and immediately discounting her. After the dining hall, he looked at her the way he looked at the territorial lords, evaluating, planning, working something out. She filed this and said nothing about it. Osran was older, past 60, with the lean, weathered quality of a man who had spent decades in political environments and had survived them by being more careful than everyone around him. He sat at the head of the council with an ease that came from long occupation. He was polite to her when their paths crossed. He spoke to her as though she were a pleasant but minor detail in a room that contained more important things. He never once looked at her as though she were a threat. That, she suspected, was the point. She spent the next 4 days paying close attention to the ordinary rhythms of the court, mapping the lines of communication, Who spoke to whom, in what order, about what kinds of things, and looking for the places where those lines ran through Osran. There were many of them, more than she would have expected from a man who presented himself as primarily administrative. On the 5th morning, she woke to find Elke already in her rooms, standing by the desk with a look on her face that Sarah had not seen before. Controlled urgency, the face of someone who is trying to remain calm about something that is not calm at all. "What happened?" Sarah said. Elke said, "There is a letter." The letter had been found in Sarah's rooms that morning, tucked between the pages of a book on her desk, written in a hand she did not recognize, and addressed to someone in the border territories with content that, if read plainly, suggested she was exchanging information with a party hostile to the Obsidian Court. It was, to anyone reading carefully, not her handwriting. The letter style was wrong, the phrasing was wrong, and several of the terms used were specific to military communication that she had never studied and would not have used. But it was on paper from the palace supply room. She recognized the watermark, and it had been found in her room. Osran presented it to the council before the morning's 3rd bell. She was brought into the council chamber while the visiting lords were still in their rooms. The chamber was smaller than the throne room, and arranged differently, not hierarchical but oval, with everyone seated in order of council rank, which put Osran at the head of a table that had no head. She stood in the center. She was aware, as she entered, that Kalen was already present, not seated at the table but standing at the far wall, near the window. He was looking at the document in front of Osran, with a perfectly contained expression that revealed nothing. Osran read the letter aloud. He asked her, politely and with the theatrical regret of a man who had planned every word of this performance, whether she had written it. "No," she said. "Is there someone who can confirm your whereabouts on the evenings in question?" She looked at him steadily. "That depends on which evenings you are referring to. I have not been shown the dates." A pause. He looked down at the document. "The 21st. I was in the library," she said, "until quite late." "Alone?" She said nothing for a moment. She glanced toward the window. Kalen's jaw tightened fractionally. He did not speak. "I was not alone the entire evening," she said carefully. "But I do not intend to speak about that in this context, and I do not think it is necessary to." Osran smiled thinly. "That is, of course, your choice. We will need to take other measures to confirm the situation. In the meantime, for the safety of the summit and its participants, I will stay in my rooms," she said, "while the investigation is conducted." A beat. He had expected to be the one to say it. "Yes," he said. "That would be advisable." She was escorted back to her rooms by 2 guards who positioned themselves at the corridor entrance, but not at her door, which gave her more freedom of movement within her wing than Osran had probably intended. She suspected the oversight was not his. He was too careful, which meant the guards had interpreted the instruction loosely. She did not correct this. That same afternoon, Elke came to her. Elke stood at the dressing room door with her hands folded in front of her and said, "There was something else." She had found it by accident, going to the sideboard to bring Sarah the tea service, and noticing that the decanter of wine left by the evening staff smelled wrong. Faintly wrong, not spoiled, different. She had not poured it. She had gone directly to Clara, who had been in the kitchens for 40 years, and had smelled most things that could be added to a drink that were not supposed to be there. Clara had taken one look at the decanter and told Elke to set it down and not touch it again, and had then sent a message to the head of the King's Guard, a man named Duncan, who was not Lord Osran's appointment. The decanter had been removed. A report had been made. Sarah sat with this information for a long time. "Does anyone know yet who put it there?" she said. "Not formally," Elke said, "but the kitchen staff roster shows who was on that wing that evening. There were 3 people. Sarah looked at her. "Do you trust Duncan?" "He is not Lord Osran's man," Elke said, which was, Sarah was beginning to understand, how Elke answered questions about trust when the answer was yes. "Then tell Duncan everything," Sarah said. "Tell him I am asking him to document everything carefully." Elke nodded. Then Sarah turned to her desk and began to work. She worked for 3 days. Not quickly, methodically, in the way of someone who knows that the value of what they are building depends on how carefully it is built. She reread every piece of information she had gathered in the 6 weeks since her arrival. The conversations with Hugh about the estate records, which mentioned property held by certain council lords in territories that did not match their registered holdings. The legal texts, which contained precedents she had read for their content, but which now she read again, looking for the specifics of how conspiracy charges were established in Northern law. The territorial histories she had worked through, which mentioned, 3 times, in 3 different volumes, a lord of the High Council, involved in a protracted legal dispute over cross-border resource management in the years before the current king's reign. A lord whose name, in all 3 volumes, was Osran. The dispute had been resolved by the previous king. The terms had required Osran's family to relinquish certain territorial claims along the eastern border, claims that, under the current king, had been slowly and quietly renegotiated back into the Osran family's possession through a series of council votes passed during periods of political disruption, including the period after Thessaly's death, when the king's attention had been fully occupied by grief and the court had been left to manage much of its own administration. She wrote it all down, in order, with citations. Elke moved between her rooms and various parts of the palace like a woman going about perfectly ordinary tasks, and every time she returned, she brought a small additional piece: a name from the kitchen records, a date from a council schedule, a note that Duncan had confirmed the decanter report was being kept in his records rather than the council's. On the 3rd evening, she put the full document in order and read it through from the beginning. It named Osran clearly. It traced 15 years of slow positioning, and it connected, through 2 pieces of land record documentation that Elke had quietly obtained from the archive room, the resources that had funded the hired men 3 years ago, to properties that had moved through a series of intermediary names and had originally been registered to a family, related by marriage, to Lord Osran. She could not prove the last connection beyond question. Not yet. But the pattern was unmistakable. She sat back in her chair. Then she asked Elke to send a message to the king. He came within 20 minutes. She laid the document on the desk in front of him and waited while he read it. He stood the entire time. She sat. When he finished, he was very still, the stillness of someone in whom something has shifted very completely and very fast. She could see it in his face, not emotion, exactly, but the aftermath of it, the way a room looks after a wind has gone through it. He turned to the last page, read it again. Then he put the document down very carefully, as though it were fragile. "The land records," he said. "Where did you get these?" "The archive room," she said. "They are palace documents. I am permitted in the library, and the archive is adjacent." He looked at her. "You have been building this for 3 days." "Longer," she said. "I just did not know what I was building it for." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he said, "The connection to the assassination. You cannot prove it directly." "No," she said, "but I know someone can." The land transfers went through a notary in the Western District. The notary would have records. Another silence. He picked up the document again and read the last page a 3rd time. She waited. "How did you know he was going to move against you?" He said. "He started looking at me differently," she said, "after the dinner with Lord Varon. I became something worth removing." He looked at her over the top of the document with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not relief, not anger, not even gratitude. Something more fundamental. Like the look of a person who has been alone in a very specific way for a very long time and has just been reminded that they are not, in fact, the only one capable of certain things. "I will handle it," he said. "I know," she said. He took the document and left. She sat alone in her rooms in the quiet, and outside the window the inner courtyard was very dark, and she found, when she reached for the steadiness that had carried her through the past 3 days, that it was still there. She let herself breathe. The 3 days of her confinement to her rooms were, she would think later, among the most productive 3 days she had spent since arriving at the palace. There was a particular quality to the work that confinement made possible. No interruptions, no social obligations, no need to manage the impression she was making on the court, or calibrate her behavior to the atmosphere of any given corridor. Just her, and the desk, and the documents, and the long, focused hours of making connections between things that had not yet been connected. She organized what she had into categories. What she could prove directly, from documents she had read and conversations she had with people whose accounts could be verified. What she could demonstrate circumstantially, from the pattern of decisions and timing and outcomes that pointed in one direction, even without a single definitive piece of evidence, and what she suspected but could not yet substantiate, which she wrote in a separate column and marked clearly as inference rather than fact, because when she presented this to Kaelin, she was not going to oversell the certainty of anything she was not certain of. Elke came in the mornings and the evenings, and was otherwise occupied with the ordinary tasks of her position, but each time she came she brought something: a detail about the kitchen roster from Clara, a note from Duncan about a conversation he had overheard, a date, extracted from the official calendar that Elke had apparently been reading carefully, that placed a key council vote 3 days after a property transfer that should have appeared unrelated. She wove these things together. By the second evening, the shape of it was visible. By the third morning, it was clear. 15 years of patient, careful work. Decisions made in the narrow windows when the king's attention was elsewhere. On foreign policy. On the aftermath of the flooding disputes. On the period of grief after Thessaly's death. Small shifts that individually meant nothing, that only became legible when you placed them in sequence, and drew a line through them, and asked what point that line was aimed at. The point was a position of sufficient control over the court's administrative and financial functions, that the Alpha King's formal power remained intact, but his effective power was substantially mediated. Not a coup, something quieter and more durable, a managed reduction. She wrote it down in the cleanest language she had, and she built the citations into the document at every point where a citation was possible, and she set it on her desk and read it through one final time. Then she sent for Elke and told her to find a way to let the king know. Osran was arrested at the second bell of morning. Sarah was awake when it happened. She heard the sounds that a palace makes when something significant moves through it. Footsteps that were faster and more purposeful than the usual night guard. A brief and distant exchange of voices. A door closing with too much decision. By dawn, the palace was a different place. Not loudly. Not in the way of a battle or a riot, but in the way of a structure whose internal arrangement has just changed, when certain things that had been holding other things in place are removed, and everything above them shifts, quietly, and fast, and in ways that had consequences. The first council member to leave was a lord named Hawes, a thin-faced man, who sat near Osran at every council session, and always spoke after him, as though his opinions required a preview. He was gone before the morning meal, his rooms empty, his horses taken from the stable at first light. 2 servants under his household departed with him. The second was a woman named Lady Croft, who held a seat on the financial subcommittee, and who, Elke told her quietly that morning, had been the one to authorize the kitchen staff rotation the night the decanter had been left in Sarah's rooms. The third was a council secretary named Pip, who was so unremarkable in his appearance and manner that he had passed through her field of observation a dozen times without catching. He left through the north gate rather than the main approach, which meant he had not been escorted, which meant someone had made an error. Duncan found her at mid-morning to tell her this, and his face had the particular look of a man who has been working at high speed without adequate information, and is holding himself together through professional discipline. "We are looking for him," he said. "He will go to one of the 2 territories most closely connected to Osran's land holdings," she said. "The route through the northern pass is faster, but the eastern road has better cover. Someone who knows he has been seen would take the eastern road." Duncan looked at her. Then he said, "I will redirect 2 riders," and left. By midday, the official summit had suspended its proceedings. The visiting lords, sensing the altered quality of the palace with the animal precision of people who survived in political environments, had retreated to their respective wings with polite excuses about rest and document review. Lord Varen had said nothing at all, and was last seen walking in the outer yard with the expression of a man rapidly revising his position on several things. At the second bell of afternoon, Sarah felt it. She could not have explained how she knew. She had not slept, and her head was slightly unclear from it, and she had been sitting at her desk trying to work through the remaining legal questions about the land record connections, when something changed. Not in the room, not anywhere she could point to, but somewhere inside her, like a shift in temperature, or the sudden awareness of a sound that had been present and unnoticed and was now, suddenly, absent. She stood up. Elke looked at her from across the room. "What is wrong?" "Where is the king?" Sarah said. "In the eastern courtyard, I think. There was a disturbance. 2 of the men from Osran's wing tried to—" Sarah was already moving. She did not run. She walked fast, purposefully, through the corridor she had mapped in her first week, and knew could get her to the eastern courtyard in 4 minutes if she did not take the long way. She took the short way. She heard it before she saw it. Not the clash of weapons, but voices raised in the particular compressed pitch of men, very close to the edge of control. She came through the arched exit and into the eastern courtyard. There were 9 men, possibly 10. She counted fast. 7 of them in Osran's household livery, the remaining 2 in the uniform of the Obsidian Court's own guard, which meant they had been turned or pressured. They had Kaelin on the back foot, not overwhelmed, not even close to overwhelmed, but held, in the sense that moving forward would mean fighting through a position that was tactically unfavorable. He saw her the moment she appeared. She saw, in the fraction of a second before he controlled it, what crossed his face. Not alarm at her presence, but the alert of a man recalibrating at speed. She walked into the center of the courtyard. She had never done anything like this before in her life. She had no weapon, no formal authority, no declared position that gave her standing to speak. She had her voice, and the information she had been building for weeks, and the understanding that words, used correctly, move things that weapons cannot. She stopped in the middle of the courtyard and looked at the men. She started on the left. Lord Osran's senior steward, she said. Owen Price. You hold land along the Eastern River. Tenant farms registered to your wife's family name. The court's revised position on the Osran holdings directly affects those farms. You are here because Osran told you your situation was better served by his release than by his imprisonment. Price stared at her. She looked at the next man. You, she said. A soldier, young, tight-faced. You are from the garrison at the Northern Pass. Your family is in Ashfen. Osran holds the trade license your brother's business runs on. He did not move, but something in his posture altered. She kept going. One by one. She had not planned this, but 6 weeks of paying attention had given her more than she had realized. She knew the name of the man who had served the gate until 2 hours ago, and whose daughter worked in a school funded by Osran's charitable trust. She knew the older soldier, whose son had been recommended for a posting that went through a council subcommittee that Osran chaired. She knew the man near the wall who owned a house on land that fell under a zoning review that had been pending, conveniently pending, she said, for 3 years, kept unresolved by a council secretary named Pip, who was even now being found on the Eastern Road. She told each of them what their situation actually was. Not what Osran had told them it was. What it was. He did not protect your interests, she said, to all of them, at the end. He built his position using your interests as currency. Your farms, your licenses, your children's futures. Those were tools he used. He is now under arrest. The protections he held over those tools are no longer his to offer or withdraw. That means you are freer than you have been in some time. And standing here, right now, is the last thing any of you should do if you want to remain free. The courtyard was very quiet. Then, slowly, the men began to step back. Not all at once, one at a time, the way the tide moves. Price first, then the young soldier, then the man near the wall. Within 4 minutes, the courtyard had 9 fewer people in it than it had had before. The 2 remaining soldiers, Kaelin's own guard who had been turned, looked at each other, and at the empty courtyard, and at Sarah, and set down the weapons they had been holding. Kaelin said, to his guards, "Take them." And they did. The courtyard was empty. He looked at her. She looked back at him. She was aware that her hands were not entirely steady, and that she was holding very still to compensate, and that her heart was making itself known in a way that the rest of her was choosing to ignore. "You came from your rooms," he said. "Yes. How did you know?" She opened her mouth to say something rational about the sounds of the palace, about the logic of the factions, about the predictable patterns of men under pressure. Then she thought better of it, because all of those things were true, but they were not the full truth. "I do not know exactly," she said. "I just knew." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something was moving in his expression that she had not seen there before, not controlled, not contained. Something that was just there, on the surface, without the usual architecture of management around it. Then he said, quietly, "Go back inside. You should rest." "So should you," she said. And she walked back toward the exit, and she did not cry until she was in the corridor, in the half-dark between 2 lanterns, where no one could see. Elke found her there a few minutes later. Elke did not say anything. She simply sat down on the floor beside her, in the corridor, in the dark, with her back against the wall, and stayed there. After a while, Sarah said, "Thank you." Elke said, "You are welcome." They sat there together until the crying finished, and the steadiness came back. Then they got up and went on. The eastern courtyard was quiet now, emptied of everyone except the two guards leading away the men who had surrendered their weapons. The stones were very cold in the late afternoon light. There was a smell of frost beginning again as the sun moved lower. Kaelin stood a few feet from her, looking at the courtyard. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him now, which was different from how she had been aware of him when she first arrived. In the beginning, she had been aware of him as a danger to be assessed, a force field she needed to map. Now she was aware of him the way you are aware of things that have become necessary, the way you are aware of the quality of the light or the sound of the river, as something that had become part of the texture of how a day felt when it was present, and how it felt when it was not. He looked at her sideways, not with the full weight of his attention, which he usually brought to everything, but with the peripheral vision of someone who is processing something they are not ready to look at directly yet. "You knew they would stand down," he said. Not a question. He was working something out. "I thought it was likely," she said honestly. People do not generally fight for something they have had fully explained to them, when what is being explained is that the thing they are fighting for was never actually for them. He looked at the empty courtyard. Then he looked at her, fully this time, with the full weight of it. "You are not what anyone expected," he said. She considered this. What did they expect? He was quiet for a moment. "Something easier to manage," he said. She thought about Osran, about the tribute system, about the 6 women who had come before her, and the ways the court had made them feel until they left. "Something easier to manage," she repeated. "And instead they got me." "Yes," he said, and something in the way he said it, flat and plain, and without any overlay of irony or distance, told her more than she could have extracted from a longer speech. She looked back at the courtyard. The sky above it was going dark at the edges. Somewhere above the palace, the first stars were appearing, very faint and very far. She would not tell him what the past 3 days had cost her. He did not need to know about the calculations she had run at 3 in the morning, or the moments of doubt she had pressed back down when they came. He did not need to know any of that. What he needed was to know that she was still here. She was still here. That was enough for now. 3 weeks after Osran's arrest, the palace was not what it had been. It was not repaired yet. That would take longer, and some of what had broken would never fully set right. But it was functional, in a way that felt different from the forced functionality of the previous months. The council had been reduced to 5 members, while the others were investigated or replaced, which meant the pace of decisions had slowed, but the decisions being made were cleaner. The visiting lords had resumed their summit with a new quality to the proceedings, less performance, more work, as though Osran's arrest had cleared a fog that everyone had been pretending not to see through. Sarah had a new role in the palace. She had not asked for it. She would not have known how to describe it if asked, but it had emerged from the aftermath of the courtyard incident, the way things emerge when they have been possible for a while, and a single event makes the possibility visible. She was consulted now, not formally, not officially, not with any title or declared position. But the court archivist brought her questions that had previously gone to the council. Duncan discussed security arrangements with her as a matter of course. Clara had somehow added her to the list of people who received the weekly supply summary, which Sarah suspected was Clara's highest expression of formal inclusion. She had begun, quietly, to work on the legal text for the tribute dissolution. She had not told anyone she was doing it. She was not yet sure it was the right moment. But she worked on it, in the library in the evenings, between other things, adding to it slowly, getting the language right. On the 22nd day after the arrest, Elke came to her with a look Sarah recognized. "What?" Sarah said. "Lord Aldrich Voss has sent ahead a request to visit," Elke said. "He is 2 days' travel out." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "He is coming," Elke said, "with your sisters." Sarah set down her pen. Kaelin told her that evening. He found her in the library, which was where he found her most evenings now, and he sat in the chair across from her and said, "Your father is coming," with the directness that she had come to understand as his form of consideration. He gave information without packaging it, because he had worked out that she preferred it that way. I know, she said. You do not have to see him, he said. She looked at him. Yes, I do. He looked back at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and did not argue. She spent the 2 days of her father's approach preparing in the same way she had prepared for every difficult thing in the past 2 months, by understanding it fully, and deciding what she was going to do before it arrived. She thought about her father's motivations carefully, without bitterness and without softness, because both would be in her way. He would want something. He would dress it in the language of family connection and concern, but underneath it was a transaction, because everything with Aldrich Voss was a transaction. She thought about what he knew. He would know about the summit, because that news traveled. He would know that Osran had been arrested, because the Obsidian Court's political shifts rippled outward quickly enough for a trading family to feel them within 2 weeks. He would know that his daughter was still in the palace, which meant she had not been sent back, which meant something had changed from what he had expected. He would be arriving to understand what that something was, and to see whether he could benefit from it. She was, she realized, not afraid of this. Or not in the way she had once been afraid of him, the smaller, shrinking kind of afraid that came from being someone's dependent. She was something else now. She was not sure yet what to call it, but she could feel its shape. The Voss carriages arrived on a Friday morning. Her father entered the hall with her sisters behind him, and the practiced confidence of a man who had spent decades entering rooms and commanding them. He was dressed well, better than she remembered, which suggested this visit had been planned for some time. He looked at Kaelin first, as though Sarah were not in the room. She led him. He made his greetings. He spoke warmly about the honor of the Obsidian Court, about his gratitude for his daughter's placement here, about the family's long-standing connection to the Northern Territories through trade relationships that he named carefully and selectively. He was good at this. She had forgotten how good he was at this. Then he began the business. The Voss family, he said, had recently had the opportunity to review their position in light of certain developments in the court. Given the arrangements that had been made, and given the clear value that Sarah had demonstrated in her time here, he said demonstrated value with the specific care of a man who has determined that this is the correct phrase. The family believed there was room for a revised understanding. He wanted a formal alliance. Trade routes through the Northern Pass, tariff exemptions on Voss merchant goods, and a title, a minor lordship to be held by Sarah, or by her father, as her family representative. In exchange, he said, the Voss family would formalize Sarah's position here as a freely given arrangement rather than a debt settlement. He said this while looking at Kaelin, as though Sarah were the furniture. She gave him until the last word. Then she said, "Father." He turned and looked at her. His expression adjusted around the edges in the way of a man recalibrating a performance for an audience he had not quite prepared for. "Sarah," he said, "you look well." "I do," she said. "Thank you." She folded her hands on the table. "I want to address your proposal, since it involves me, and you have been speaking about me as though I am not here." His mouth tightened fractionally. "Of course. The debt was settled when I arrived," she said. "That agreement was made, signed, and completed. There is no further financial obligation between our family and this court, and therefore no leverage on either side. The arrangement cannot be renegotiated because it is already concluded." He started to speak. She continued. "The title you are requesting does not work the way you think it does in Northern law. A title here is not a courtesy appointment. It carries land obligations, military obligations, and council responsibilities that are binding and non-transferable. You cannot hold it by proxy, and I have no standing to grant it, so that is not available." He shifted his weight. He was looking at her differently now. Not quite the way he had looked at her in the study, with that settled, comfortable certainty. Something had shifted in the accounting. "The trade routes through the Northern Pass," she continued, "are currently under revised terms as a result of the summit that just concluded. The new terms were negotiated by the Eastern River Lords and will not accommodate additional exemptions for individual merchant families without going through the full council review process, which is currently occupied with other matters and will be for the next several months." She paused. "I can send you the formal application when the review process opens. If the Voss family's trade relationship with the Northern Territories meets the criteria, you are welcome to apply." He stared at her. Mira and Lena were standing 2 steps behind him. Mira's hands were folded very tightly. Lena was looking at her feet. "Sarah," her father said. His voice had a different quality now, quieter. The performance thinned. "I only want what is best. For the family," she said. "I know. I understand that. What I want you to understand is that the family and I are no longer the same thing. I am not a Voss resource. I am not a settlement. I am not a position to be negotiated. I live here now." She held his gaze. "If you would like to have a relationship with me, you are welcome to write me a letter that contains no requests. If I decide I would like to respond, I will." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he straightened his jacket, the same motion, the same gesture he had used in the study the night he told her she was leaving, and made a short bow toward the high table, and walked toward the doors. Mira and Lena followed. At the doors, Mira stopped. She turned around. She walked back through the hall, past the long table, and stopped at the edge of Sarah's reach. She looked at her with an expression Sarah had not seen on her sister's face before, uncertain, and a little small, and slightly wretched. "I did not think it would be you," Mira said. He had been talking about sending someone for over a year. "I thought it would be me, and then when he said it was you, She stopped. "I was relieved. And I knew that. And I was relieved anyway. And I am sorry." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. "I know," she said. "Thank you for saying it." Mira looked at her, at all of her, at the chair at the right side of the high table, at the hall and the court and the woman who had been her quiet, bookish younger sister, and had become something she did not have a word for. "You are different," she said. "Yes," Sarah said. "I am." Mira nodded, once, and turned and went. The great hall was quiet. Sarah sat with it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen, which she had set down when her father arrived, and went back to the document she had been working on. The tribute dissolution. She had just found the right phrasing for the third clause. She thought about it later, alone in the library, with the dissolution document open in front of her, and the evening settling into the palace corridors outside. She thought about the expression on her father's face when he realized she was not going to give him what he had come for. Not anger, not at first. Something more confused than anger. The expression of a man who has walked into a room expecting a certain kind of furniture, and found the layout entirely rearranged. He had never seen her like this before. None of them had. She had been, in the Voss household, the youngest daughter, the quiet one, the reader, the one who did not cause trouble and did not demand attention and did not require the management that Mira had required from early childhood or the emotional navigation that Lena's more complicated temperament had always needed. She had been easy, she had been convenient. She understood, sitting in the library with the dissolution document and the spring evening and the distant sound of the river, that this was not something to be angry about anymore, or not primarily. It was a fact about the conditions she had grown up in, and it had made her into the person who had sat down in her father's study 8 months ago and listened without interrupting, and then packed a bag with careful precision and got into a carriage and looked out at the disappearing lights of Kalber and decided, without drama, that she was going to meet whatever came next, with her eyes open. The conditions had made her. She was not going to waste energy, being bitter about the conditions. Mira's apology had surprised her more than her father's performance had, not because she had not believed Mira capable of it, but because it was honest in a way she had not expected, and it had cost something, and Mira had given it anyway, standing in the middle of the great hall with her hands clasped, and her face uncertain, and the words coming out without the packaging of politeness around them. "I know. Thank you for saying it." It had been the truest thing she could give back. She turned a page in the dissolution document and picked up her pen. The fourth clause was almost right. Not quite. She read it again, slowly, and found the phrase that was not pulling its weight, and replaced it with one that did, and read the clause through again, and found it correct. She kept working. She made her decision in the library, late on a Thursday evening in early spring. Winter had broken gradually over the past 3 weeks, the kind of slow thaw that happens in the north. Not a sudden warmth, but a gradual relenting, the snow pulling back from the stones, the bare trees in the inner courtyard, beginning to suggest something at the tips of their branches that might, in another few weeks, become leaves. The river in the valley below the palace was running high and fast and very loud, and on clear mornings she could hear it from her window. She had been working on the tribute dissolution document since January. It was finished now, properly finished, not just complete but correct. reviewed against the applicable law texts, and, in 2 carefully chosen sections, expanded to account for arguments she expected would be raised against it. She had given a draft to Elka 3 weeks ago, and asked her to read it with a critical eye. Elka had returned it with 6 precise marginal notes, all of which Sarah had addressed. She had also been working on something else, quietly, without telling anyone. Working through the old ceremony texts she had found in the archive room, not the contemporary ones, which were formal and largely administrative, but the older volumes from the first generations of the Obsidian Court, when the traditions were still written in the old northern tongue, and the language of them was different, more direct, more honest about what the ceremonies actually were and what they actually meant. She had been learning that language. It was not easy. The grammar structure was unlike any language she knew, but she had worked through it in the library evenings, looking up every word until she could speak the phrases correctly, until the sounds sat properly in her mouth and meant what they were supposed to mean. She told Kalen on a Thursday evening. He was in the library. He was always there by the late hour now. They had settled into it without discussion over the months, the way 2 people settle into habits that are comfortable and have become necessary, without either of them explicitly choosing them. He was reading something from the military correspondence files. She was working through her final review of the dissolution document. She set down her pen. "I want to hold the bonding ceremony," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He set down the file. "I want to hold it before the new council is fully seated," she continued, "while the old structures are still being replaced. It changes the character of what we are building if we do it now rather than later." He looked at her. "You have been thinking about this for a while." "Since February," she said. He was still looking at her. Something in his expression was the same thing she had seen in the courtyard after she had spoken the men out of their positions. "The thing that had no armor around it. The ceremony," he said carefully. "What you are describing. In the northern tradition, it is not administrative." "I know," she said. "I read the old texts. It is permanent." "I know," she said. He was quiet. She said, "I am not asking you because I need permission. I am telling you because you are part of it, and you should know what I have decided. If you want to say something, say it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "No, I do not want to say anything." She nodded and picked up her pen. He went back to his file. But she noticed, for the rest of the evening, that he read the same page 3 times. She chose the date, the 7th day of the new month, which according to the old texts was the day of practical beginnings, chosen by the first Obsidian Court monarchs, for decisions meant to stand through difficulty and years. She chose the form, the shorter of the 2 traditional ceremonies, the one that was direct and without ceremony for its own sake, which seemed right for both of them. She chose the words. She had written them herself, in the old tongue and in the common tongue together, weaving them so that neither version was a translation of the other, but both were true at the same time. She did not tell the court what she was doing until the day before. The morning of the 7th, the palace was very quiet, in the way that places get quiet when something significant is about to happen, and everyone knows it, but no one has said it directly. She dressed in the clothes she had chosen herself. Not court dress, not morning dress, not any of the prescribed categories. A dark dress in a deep green gray, well-made, clean-lined, with a collar she had modified herself to suit the old ceremony's requirements. She wore her grandmother's ring, the small plain gold one, on her right hand. Elka helped her with her hair, and did not say a single word the entire time, which was its own kind of eloquence. The court assembled in the great hall. The visiting lords, who had remained through the winter, were present along the eastern wall. The new council members, not yet formally seated, stood along the south, the kitchen staff, the archive staff, the ground staff, all of them present, which was unusual, and which Clara had apparently arranged without being asked. Duncan and his guard stood at the doors. Kalen was at the far end of the room, at the step below the throne. He was dressed plainly, as he always was, with the single emblem at his chest. He looked, she thought, as she walked in through the great doors, and began the long walk down the hall, like himself. Completely and entirely himself, with nothing performed, and nothing held back, and she thought that was the thing about him that had always mattered the most. She walked the length of the hall alone. She stopped 3 steps from him. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and in the silence before she spoke, the whole room was very still, and the only sound was the fire in the 2 great hearths along the walls, and somewhere outside the high windows, the distant sound of the river running fast through the valley. She said the words in the old tongue first. They were not what anyone expected. She could feel that in the quality of the silence, the way it shifted when the first phrase left her mouth, the collective surprise of a court that had prepared itself for the conventional form and was receiving something else entirely. The old words were not a vow of service or submission or loyalty in the conventional sense. They were a statement of fact, of what she was, what she brought, what she chose to bind herself to and why, and the choice being made because it was right and chosen freely, and not because it was demanded or convenient or arranged by someone else's hand. She said them cleanly, with the pronunciation she had worked on for 2 months, every consonant in its correct place, and when she finished, the room was still silent, and she could see in the faces of the court that the old tongue had been unexpected, and that it had landed the way honest things land when you have been surrounded by careful things for too long. She said the words in the common tongue after, so that everyone present understood them fully. When she was done, Kalen stepped back from the throne. He stepped aside. Not behind her, not away. He moved to the right, to the position that was beside and below, next to where the crown sat on its stone holder at the edge of the dais. And then he waited. She looked at the crown for a moment. She had seen it every time she was in the throne room, had noted its weight and proportion, the way she noted everything in rooms she frequented, but she had not touched it before. It was dark metal, with a simple band of worked northern stone. Nothing ornate about it, nothing that was there purely for appearance. It was a thing built to be worn by someone who had work to do. She took it off its holder. It was heavier than she expected. She placed it on her own head. The room was absolutely silent. Then, somewhere near the back, near the doors where the kitchen and ground staff had gathered, a sound began. Not applause, not cheering, but a single sustained note, low and clear, the acknowledgement she had read about in the old texts. The sound the court made when a thing was witnessed and recognized as true. It started with one person, and it moved through the room, slowly at first, and then faster, until the whole hall was making it together, and the sound rose into the high ceiling of the great hall, and filled it with something that was not noise but resonance, something that had a weight to it, the way the river had a weight, the way the mountains had a weight, permanent and undeniable. She stood with the crown on her head and looked at Kalen. He was looking back at her with the expression she had no word for before, but had a word for now, the one that was not held back, not managed, not performing anything for any audience. The one that was simply there, entirely present, aimed completely at her. In the weeks that followed, she worked. The tribute dissolution was signed into law on the first council meeting after the ceremony. It was not contested. She had anticipated and pre-addressed every legal argument against it within the document itself, and the 2 council members who might have raised objections had been replaced by people who understood which direction the court was moving in, and had decided they would rather be part of that movement than stand against it. The tribute system that had brought 6 women to the Obsidian Palace, including her, was ended, formally, permanently, with the court seal pressed into the wax, while the full council watched and the record was made in the official register. The eastern trade routes were opened under the revised terms she had negotiated with the river lords during the summit's final days. The routes had been restricted for 15 years, closed during the same period when Osran had been quietly consolidating his territorial holdings, and opening them changed the economic character of 3 territories almost immediately. The first reports from the eastern traders came back within 2 weeks. Volume was up, transit times were lower, and there were new businesses being established along the route's midpoints that had been waiting years for exactly this. She appointed Elke to the newly formed position on the reformed council. Not a courtesy seat, not a ceremonial inclusion, but a working position with actual responsibility for internal court administration, and a direct reporting line that went to Sarah and to no one else. Elke had received this information with the same contained expression she used for most things, and had said simply, "I will need an office." And Sarah had shown her to the room she had already arranged 2 floors above the archive, with a window that faced the mountains, and enough shelf space for all the documentation Elke was clearly going to accumulate. On the evening of the first day of the 2nd month after the ceremony, she was on the high balcony of the central wing, the one that looked out over the full valley, the river, the pines, the mountains beyond them, the long flat light of a spring evening, settling over all of it in layers of gold and gray. Kaylin came out and stood beside her. They looked at the valley in the quiet. Below, the river was loud enough to hear even from this height. The trees along its banks were coming into leaf, a pale new green that was different from the deep green of midsummer, tentative but real. After a while he said, "You know they are writing stories about you in the South." "I know," she said. "The version I heard had you arriving in armor." "I arrived in a wool coat," she said, "with a jar of peppermint balm and 3 books." "I know," he said. "I saw you." She looked at him. He was looking at the valley. Then he turned and looked at her, with the expression that she had a word for now, the one that was not held back and not managed, and was simply, entirely, genuinely there. "My father sold me to a monster," she said. "Yes," he said. "And now I am here." "Yes," he said. She looked back at the valley. The river caught the last of the light below them, a long moving ribbon of brightness threading between the dark pines. The mountains behind it were still and enormous, and had been there long before any of them, and would be thereafter, unmoved by any of this, indifferent to all of it, in the way that very old things are indifferent, and she found that restful rather than diminishing. She thought about the girl who had sat in the carriage 11 months ago, with a bag in her lap, and her spine straight, and her eyes on the dark road ahead, deciding, quietly, that she would not be broken by what came next. She thought about the woman standing here now. They were the same person. That was the thing no story written about her would ever quite get right. Not the versions that said she had been transformed, rescued, elevated, changed by the place, or the king, or the crown, or any force outside herself. She had not been transformed. She had been, all along, exactly this. The same clarity, the same attention, the same stubborn willingness to look directly at hard things and stay standing while she did it. The palace and the king and the crown had not made her. They had given her room. They had given her the space to be the full size of what she already was, and that was a different thing entirely from being made. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "For not sending me away," she said. He was quiet. Then he said, "Thank you for not going." The valley held the last light as long as it could. Then the evening came fully, the way evenings come in the north, without apology and all at once, and the stars appeared over the black mountains, sharp and very cold and very numerous. The same stars that had been above the road the night she had left home, watching from the same places they had always occupied, unchanged by any of it. She stood beside him under them, in the place she had built with her own hands and her own mind, in the life she had chosen with full knowledge of what she was choosing, and she felt the weight of all of it clearly, and without flinching. Not the weight of the crown, though that was real enough. The weight of everything the crown meant, the work it represented, and the work still ahead. The court rebuilt, and the routes opened, and the old cruelties formally ended, and written into the record where they could not be quietly undone. Elke, in her office, 2 floors above the archive, already working. Clara, in the kitchens. Hugh in the east garden where the drainage problem had finally been solved. Duncan at the gates. The valley below, with the river running through it like a thread, connecting everything to everything else. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was hers. 3 weeks after the ceremony, she was in the archive room looking for a supplementary legal reference when she found Elke there already, surrounded by files, in the process of reorganizing the record-keeping system that had apparently not been properly updated since before the previous king's reign. Elke did not look up when Sarah came in. She was making notes in a small book with a precise, unhurried hand. "Is there a problem with the current system?" Sarah said. "Several," Elke said. "The cross-referencing for property documents is inconsistent. The dating convention changed 3 times between 1870 and 1910, and nobody standardized it retroactively, and there are gaps in the council vote records for a period of 11 years in the middle of the century that are going to be relevant to 3 of the ongoing cases and have never been properly accounted for. How long will it take to fix?" Elke considered this with the expression of a woman who had already calculated the answer and was deciding whether to give the honest number. 6 months, she said, for a version that works. Another year for a version that is correct. Good, Sarah said. Start with the property documents. Elke looked up then. She looked at Sarah with the expression she used when something had surprised her and she was deciding how to respond to it. Then she looked back at her notes. "I already did," she said. Sarah smiled, which she did not do very often in the archive room, and went to find her reference. The days after the ceremony had a different character from the days before. Not easier, exactly. There was still an enormous amount of work to do, still the slow rebuilding of a court that had been mismanaged for 15 years, still the 100 small decisions each day that accumulated into direction. But the work had a different feeling to it now. It felt like hers. It felt like she was building something that she had chosen to build, in a place she had chosen to be, with tools she had earned through paying attention for a long time, and using what she found. She had not known, 11 months ago, sitting in a carriage in the dark with her spine straight and her bag in her lap, that this was where the road would bring her. She had not planned for this. She had planned only for the next thing, and then the thing after that, and somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those next things she had arrived here. She had learned something from that. She was not sure yet that she could articulate it. But it had to do with the difference between trying to see the whole of a road before you begin walking it, which was impossible, and simply walking, and paying attention to what was under your feet, and trusting that you would recognize the right turnings when you came to them. She had recognized them. She was here,